Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're setting off on a really fascinating journey. The history of music in ancient Iran. And this deep dive, it's specifically for you as a professional musician.
Right.
You've given us some fantastic resources, excerpts on the Achaemenid and Parthian empires, plus a broader look at music across different ancient dynasties there.
Really rich stuff to work with.
Definitely. Our goal here is to give you this unique historical, cultural context, something that, enriches how you understand music's evolution and just how important it was in a place with such an incredibly deep artistic past.
Makes sense. You can't really understand the music without understanding the world it came from.
Precisely. Okay, let's unpack this. To really get the musical story, maybe we should start with a bigger picture. The civilizations on the Iranian plateau.
Absolutely. The music didn't just appear out of nowhere, right? It's all tied up with the history, the society, the politics. So yeah, starting point.
Yeah.
The Median dynasty.
Okay, the Medes.
Often called the first big Aryan empire, came even before the famous Persians, the Achaemenids. Herodotus talks about them, among others.
And their capital was Ecbatana, which is near modern Hamadan in Iran today.
That's the place.
Now, it's worth saying, direct evidence from the Medes themselves. It's a bit thin on the ground, isn't it?
It really is. We're mostly relying on what later folks wrote down. Achaemenids, Assyrians, Babylonians.
Right. So it's like trying to sketch a building based on descriptions from people who saw it much later. So what can we say about their music from those sources?
Well, even with those limitations, we can sort of make out three main areas for their music.
Okay.
Military music, court music, and religious music.
Uh-huh.
And what's really interesting is how important musicians seem to have been.
Important how? Not just players.
Apparently not. They seem to have held, positions with real influence.
Huh. That story about Ugaras, the Median court musician, that kind of brings it home, doesn't it?
It really does. Mary Boyce mentions it, how Ugaras supposedly predicted the fall of the Medes right there at a banquet for King Astyages.
Wow, that makes you think, doesn't it? Was their music tied into social commentary, maybe even predicting things? Like, did they have a deeper read on society?
It's a great question. That story certainly hints that musicians were respected, maybe enough to voice things others couldn't, or perhaps they just had a knack for understanding the currents of the time.
And there's more, right? Sources say they sometimes knew about astronomy, too.
Exactly, which suggests they were maybe broader intellectuals, not just focused solely on musical technique.
Interesting. What about the military music side? You mentioned that category.
Yeah, the evidence there is, like you said about Median sources generally, a bit less abundant. Probably because the empire itself wasn't around as long as, say, the Achaemenids.
That makes sense. A longer-lasting empire would likely leave more behind. But, okay, religious music. That seems a bit clearer.
It does, yeah. Median religious music was really tied into the Zoroastrian faith. Hymns, songs, but performed only inside temples.
Only in temples. So it underscored how sacred they saw music.
Definitely.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about nice sounds. Music had this fundamental spiritual job to do.
So it wasn't just like reading the texts aloud. The actual singing mattered.
Absolutely crucial. The Avesta, their main scripture, talks about the gathas, these key hymns needing to be sung, not just recited. The melody wasn't decoration. It was part of the spiritual message itself.
That's powerful. The melody carrying spiritual weight. And did that filter down into everyday life?
It seems so. Apparently there was this habit of humming tunes, and it was linked to spiritual purification. So music was woven into, well, both the big rituals and personal spirituality.
That focus on music's spiritual power really sets the stage for what comes later, doesn't it?
It really does. It's a foundation.
Okay, so from the Medes, we jump to the Achaemenids, Cyrus the Great. A vast, influential dynasty. His conquests alone were pretty staggering.
Oh, absolutely. Under Cyrus, you get Media, Elam, Chaldea, Assyria, Lydia. Basically pulled together a huge chunk of the ancient Near East.
And his successors kept going.
Cambyses added Egypt. Darius the Great pushed into the Indus Valley, parts of Greece.
The sheer size. Sirdaria River down to Abyssinia, Indus over to the Black Sea. Hard to even picture.
It really is. And crucially, they weren't just conquerors. They were known for their administration, too.
Right, pulling together all these different cultures.
Exactly. Centralized government, reasonably fair laws, order, security, some level of freedom, building communication networks. It allowed for a lot of cultural exchange.
Which naturally brings us back to music. That cultural blending must have had an effect.
Seems like it did. Xenophon actually mentions musicians in Cambyses' time inventing and playing new musical modes.
Okay, modes. For our listener, the professional musician, when we hear modes in this ancient context, are we talking something like early scale, melodic framework?
That's a good way to put it, yeah. Likely systems of organizing melody, patterns that gave the music its character. And the fact that they were inventing new ones suggests, a living, evolving musical scene, fed by all those different cultures rubbing shoulders.
A sonic melting pot? Sounds amazing.
Yeah.
But, like with the maids, finding direct Achaemenid musical evidence, it's tricky, isn't it?
Surprisingly tricky, yeah. We're still leaning heavily on Greek historians, much later Islamic texts, the Shahnameh epic archaeological finds.
So still piecing it together from fragments.
Pretty much. Strabo, for example, he notes that Iranian tunes back then often focused on telling stories of heroes or prayers to the gods. Gives us a hint about themes, maybe the emotional vibes.
And that story from the Sayasatnama about Darius's coronation, 360 women singing together in harmony.
Right. From different provinces, apparently.
Yeah.
That number and the harmony part, it really points towards, serious musical organization, coordination.
Yeah, not just a random sing-along. Suggests training, shared practices, maybe.
Exactly. It hints at a pretty sophisticated setup to pull off something like that, drawing performers from across the empire.
But then you have Herodotus saying there was no music during royal meals, even though there were lots of court musicians around. Seems a bit odd.
It does seem a bit contradictory at first glance. Maybe it points to how structured court life was, like music was for specific ceremonies or formal entertainment or religion, but just not for, dinner etiquette.
Could be.
But then again, Xenophon claims Alexander the Great found 320 musical instruments in Cyrus's treasury. So clearly, music was a big part of court life, even if it wasn't always front and center.
Makes sense. And military music was definitely there, too.
Oh, yeah. Accounts of Cyrus chanting before battle, followed by trumpet signals for troop movements, using music for morale and practical battlefield stuff.
And that later account about Darius III and Alexander,
from Quintus Curtius Rufus, mentions lighting fires, magi chanting before battle, adds this ritual layer to the military music, maybe trying to get divine help or just scare the enemy. Suggests it became maybe more complex over time.
And the religious music, the Zoroastrian gathas and rituals, that continued strong.
Right. So the Achaemenid era, it feels like they built on what the Medes had, but also absorbed new things, adapted music for this huge, diverse empire.
Even if we don't have the sheet music, so to speak.
Exactly. We don't have notation or theory books from then, but all the different mentions, types of performers, contexts, instruments, found it points to a really rich and varied musical world.
Like those instruments they've dug up, out-types, harps.
Yeah, out-like things, harps, maybe an early organ type, the chagana percussion, and then the military stuff, trumpets, different kinds of drums like the nakare, kus, kamere, gavdem, the karnasorna.
That karna they found near Persepolis is amazing, over a meter long.
Yeah, near Artaxerxes III's tomb. Definitely classed as a military trumpet. They even measured it 5-centimeter mouthpiece, 50-centimeter wide bell. Gives you a real tangible link, even if we can only guess how it sounded.
Okay, so after the Achaemenids fall to Alexander, we get the Seleucid dynasty.
Right, 330 to about 187 BCE. This is the period where Greek culture, Hellenism, is really promoted by the rulers in those Iranian lands.
It's a shorter phase in this story, and sounds like Greek influence was strong, maybe pushing out local arts. But there's that quote, James Darmestetter saying, Alexander made Greece Iranian. He did not make Iran Greek.
That's a really insightful quote, yeah.
It suggests it wasn't just a one-way street, maybe. For you, as a musician, how might that Hellenistic influence have mixed with Iranian music?
Well, even if the rulers pushed Greek culture, the Iranian traditions wouldn't just, disappear overnight. It's very possible there was some blending, some syncretism. Maybe Iranian musicians picked up Greek techniques or vice versa, or maybe certain melodic ideas got exchanged. Direct proof is hard to find. But usually when cultures mix like that, you get some artistic fusion, even if it's subtle and not obvious in the records we have left.
It's fascinating to think about those potential musical conversations. But the sources also say it was a pretty chaotic time. Lots of fighting.
It was. Political instability, military campaigns that probably took precedence over, say, sponsoring purely Iranian arts. The Seleucid focus was more on control and Hellenistic culture.
So maybe not a peak time for Iranian musical innovation itself.
Probably not significant independent growth, based on what we know. There's that little mention in Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, the epic poem, about packs and drums when Alexander meets some women. Just a tiny hint that drums, at least, were still around.
Right. A transitional period, maybe some quiet blending, but not a major chapter for distinct Iranian music. Okay, let's shift to the next big players. The Arsacid dynasty, the Parthians.
The Parthians, yeah. Rose up around 249 BCE, ruled till 226 CE. They were Aryan tribes, originally from Khorasan, famous for being amazing horsemen and archers. They kick out the Seleucids.
Ashk was their first king, right? And they gradually took over Iran.
That's the story. Their official language became Middle Persian, Pahlavi, written using Aramaic script. And religion-wise, Zoroastrianism was still big, but also Mithraism gained prominence. You had famous temples to Anahita in places like Kangavar.
And here, we start seeing actual mentions of music education.
Yes, there's a later book from the Sasanian period called Karnamaki Ardashir-i Babakan, but it looks back and mentions teaching pleasant melodies in Arsacid schools.
Okay, so for a professional musician listening, what does putting music in the school curriculum back then suggest about how they valued it?
It strongly suggests that being musically skilled was seen as, well, a good thing, part of being a well-rounded person in their society. It implies formal teaching, passing down traditions.
So likely a body of musical knowledge and technique they thought was important enough to teach systematically.
Exactly. It hints at that.
But there was also this interesting mix, wasn't there? Some Parthian kings liked Greek culture too.
Yeah, some were definitely Philhellenic lovers of Greek things. Plutarch even writes about Greek songs and recitations happening at Parthian court celebrations.
Yeah.
So again, this complex cultural picture.
So as a certain openness, maybe, appreciating Greek arts while still being Parthian.
Seems like it. And that kind of exchange can definitely spark new artistic ideas.
We also get more specifics on instruments again.
Right. Another Pahlavi book, Yadgari Zarian, mentions military drums and trumpets being used to call soldiers together at King Vistaf's palace.
And that decorated goblet found at Nisa.
Oh yeah, that's a fantastic find. Shows two Parthian musicians, one with something like a lyre, the other with the wind instrument, maybe like a dunay or dunlai, and they're next to this scene of beheading a sheep, oddly enough.
Huh. Well, ignoring the sheep part for a moment, it gives us a visual on the instruments.
Exactly. These little visual and text clues are gold. But maybe the most significant thing about Parthian music is the tradition of storytelling. Kaniagari, or gusan.
The gusan, tell us more about them.
These gusan, the term referred to both the musicians and the singers. They were absolutely vital. They were like the keepers of national heritage. They interpreted current events. They recorded ancient stories and achievements through song and music.
So way more than just entertainers. They were living history books, cultural commentators, passing down legends.
Precisely. There's that interesting quote Mary Boyce cites from a reconstruction of an Arsacid text by W.B. Henning. Something like, the Gusan praise the old kings and heroes, but never achieve anything themselves.
Ouch. That gives an interesting angle on how society saw them, maybe.
It really does. That classic paradox for artists, sometimes essential for culture, but maybe not seen as holding real power like warriors or rulers.
And music and poetry were really tangled up together then.
Very much so. Hard to draw a line. In a way, when poems and songs from that era were written down, it was a form of recording their music history.
And music was also used for education through these story songs.
Yeah, Mary Boyce mentioned Strabo talking about narrative songs teaching the deeds of gods and heroes. And there's even speculation about an Iranian song listing, like 360 uses for the date palm tree.
Wow. Music as a way to transmit practical knowledge, too.
Exactly. Shows just how versatile music was: entertainment, ritual, history, and practical education.
And we have physical evidence, too, right? Statues.
Yeah, there's terracotta statues found in Susa, showing Arsacid storytellers. One holds an instrument that looks like a tambour, the other something like a barbate. Gives us a sense of how old those instrument types are in Iran.
Plus that Parthian long-necked lute artifact.
Right, dated around 3 BC to 3 AD. All these pieces add to the picture.
It's clear that by Parthian times, music was just everywhere. Education, storytelling, court, military. The fact that scholars talk about Parthian music as a specific field, that says a lot.
It really does. The surviving instruments give us tantalizing hints about what their world might have sounded like.
Okay, so let's try and pull this together as we wrap up this deep dive. We've seen music playing these really significant roles all the way from the Medes through the Achaemenids, the Seleucids, and the Arsacid Parthians.
Absolutely not static at all. It was dynamic,
Yeah.
changing with the culture, the politics, the society around it.
From being at the spiritual core for the Medes to the imperial stage of the Achaemenids, maybe blending with Greek ideas under the Seleucids, and then becoming this vital storytelling force with the Parthian Gusan. It's quite a journey.
A really rich, complex history unfolding through sound.
And for you, our listener, the professional musician, digging into this ancient Iranian music history, hopefully it provides a deeper foundation, a different kind of context for your own work and thinking about music. So here's where it gets really interesting. Thinking about all this, the sophisticated performances they clearly had, the deep spiritual meaning, the crucial cultural jobs music did back then in ancient Iran. How might knowing this history actually enrich your musical practice today? How does it make you think about music's power across different times and places? What other questions does this deep dive maybe spark for you? Questions about music, culture, history, things you might want to explore further.
Yeah, definitely food for thought. Reflecting on these ancient roots can give fresh perspectives on what music does, how it works in society, how it carries knowledge, how it expresses, well, the deepest parts of being human.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the history of music in ancient Iran. We really hope it's given you some illuminating insights to take away.